Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into something extremely specific and wildly bureaucratic Byzantine silk inspection. That's right. You're headed to a world where robes were weighed like gold, inspectors chewed fabric like connoisseurs, and the empire's economy sometimes depended on a man biting a bolt of cloth. You probably won't survive this if you have any residual trauma from spreadsheets, tax forms, or the phrase quality assurance audit. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? And what time is it there? I always love seeing which corners of the globe are slowly being bored to sleep together. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through Constantinople, but not the postcard version. Not the domes or the mosaics. You're deep in the belly of the beast through corridors lined with flaking frescoes, past sweating scribes hunched over reed pens and official ledgers the size of oxen. The air is stale with ink, wax, and the faintest whiff of sandalwood oil meant to disguise the smell of far too many humans doing paperwork in a room with no windows. And there, hunched over a wooden counter, is a man with a short beard, stained fingertips, and a bolt of crimson silk clenched lightly between his teeth. This is the silk inspector. A bureaucrat. Yes, but one whose mouth holds the fate of a dozen looms and a dozen more craftsmen. He isn't chewing. He's pressing, gently, feeling the weave, testing the texture. He'll taste it. Then he'll decide if it meets the standards of the emperor's household or gets carted back to the dye vats. Yes, this was real. Mainstream historians confirm that textile quality in Byzantium was so tightly controlled. Silk was often inspected by texture and mouthfeel before it ever made it into a robe or tapestry. Certain bureaucrats were literally trained to bite fabric not to damage it, but to test for softness, tightness, and purity of weave. You walk past his desk and see a stack of rejected cloths to one side. They aren't torn, but they've each got the tiniest bite mark or indentation along one edge. A secret sign between departments, this one failed the mouth test. One scroll nearby outlines silk grades imperial, ecclesiastical, trade, and merchant, each with strict parameters. Touch it, wrong penalty. Sell it under the wrong label, double penalty. Try to pass off low-grade silk as high-grade by starching it or spraying it with perfume. Immediate bureaucratic doom. Possibly a fine. Definitely some unpleasant extra duties like counting tassels for 6 weeks. Fringe detail. Some documents describe special silk inspectors nicknamed dentators, literally the biters. That's not a joke. They were respected, oddly feared, and sometimes consulted in legal disputes over counterfeit cloth. You could be tried in court based on what a bureaucrat's incisors reported. And here's where the fun starts. Historians still argue whether this tasting method was purely symbolic, a kind of ceremonial test, or a genuine quality control technique backed by subtle oral sensitivity. Some believe the practice became so entrenched in bureaucracy that no one questioned its usefulness anymore. It was just how things were done. You turn the corner and find another inspector with a different method, pressing silk between his fingers, holding it up to the light, then sighing, audibly, as if the cloth has disappointed him personally. He jots something in his ledger, then waves a servant over. The silk is bundled away, and a new bolt is delivered. Every yard of cloth goes through this. Every shipment logged. Every color, texture, shimmer noted. The silk is state property. After all, imported, taxed, dyed under license, sold under supervision. It's an economy, a symbol, and a statement. Wearing the wrong silk at the wrong time could get you noticed in all the wrong ways. But for now, you step deeper into the office. The floors creak. The walls sweat. The silence hums with the faint, almost reverent sound of silk being pressed, rubbed, bitten, judged. It's oddly hypnotic. And in the distance, a man sneezes into a bolt of raw linen and is immediately escorted out. This is not just administration. This is Byzantine administration. You move deeper into the office block, your sandals scuffing softly across a marble floor that's been polished not by cleaning, but by centuries of dragging crates full of paperwork across it. The light here is thin, filtered through dusty windows or flickering lamplight. Somewhere a clerk coughs. Somewhere else, someone drops a stylus and mutters a prayer under their breath. And overhead, dozens of shelves groan beneath scrolls, thousands of them sorted by region, category, cloth weight, and thread density. Welcome to the Byzantine civil service, where nothing was too small to be filed in triplicate. Here, bureaucracy isn't just a part of governance, it is governance. You walk past rows of desks where men in carefully folded tunics count silken tassels, weigh bolts of fabric by the inch, and ink tiny numbers into margins already crammed with text. One man is scribbling so fast that the sleeve of his robe is frayed from elbow friction alone. Another is holding a cloth up to a flame to make sure the sheen isn't artificially enhanced. You find yourself impressed and also mildly concerned. Mainstream historical fact. The Byzantine Empire ran on a famously complex bureaucratic engine. At its peak, it employed entire departments to oversee taxation, trade, industry, imports, exports, court attire, and the imperial wardrobe. The silk trade, in particular, was one of the empire's most heavily regulated economic sectors. And within that system, silk wasn't treated like a product. It was treated like currency, ideology, and national security rolled into one. Every step from raw cocoons to finished garments was documented, taxed, inspected, categorized, and then filed. Somewhere in these walls is a scroll noting the delivery of 4 bolts of blue silk to a bishop in Cappadocia, with a tiny marginal annotation reading, "Smelled faintly of fish. Investigate." You pause at one particularly grim-looking table where a senior clerk is reviewing receipts with the solemnity of a funeral rite. His fingers, ink-stained and trembling slightly with age, move from column to column. He doesn't even glance up as you walk by. He's not ignoring you. He simply has more pressing concerns, like verifying the treadle warp ratio in a shipment that was allegedly too soft. Fringe tidbit. Some surviving reports suggest that minor infractions in silk quality control could result in demotion, public fines, or assignment to undesirable departments like wool tabulation or, heaven forbid, tax grain inventory. And if you think this is all excessive, you're not alone. Historians still argue whether this Byzantine obsession with administration was functional genius or pathological micromanagement. Some call it the reason the empire survived so long. Others think it slowly strangled innovation and made everything dependent on signature stamps and long-form parchment tantrums. But there's no question it worked for a while. The empire knew that silk wasn't just cloth. It was a signal. It told other nations we're powerful, we're organized, and we look better than you doing it. And that signal had to be protected, even if it meant dedicating an entire building to people whose job was to look deeply disappointed at shimmer inconsistencies. You take a seat near a window ledge stacked with rejected garments. One robe is flawless to your eye, deep purple, soft as river mist, and embroidered with gold. but a tiny tag stitched into the hem reads, Class 2 Minor Warp Unevenness. Someone spotted that, filed it, flagged it. You close your eyes for a moment. You can almost hear the papyrus rustle, the wax seals being pressed, the faint creak of leather-bound files sliding into wall cubbies, a sigh from a junior clerk who's just realized he's been copying the wrong ledger for 6 days. And still, behind it all, the deeper hum of imperial control. The state doesn't just govern. It observes. It records. It decides what counts, what shimmers, what bites correctly between the teeth. You open your eyes. This wasn't just paperwork. It was survival in silk form. You stretch slightly, stand, and brush the scroll dust from your hands. Then continue on past the cubicles of silent scribes and into a different kind of chamber. The air here changes. It's cooler, still thick with parchment and candle soot, but laced now with the soft, faint perfume of something luxurious, something expensive. Because now you're standing in the Imperial Silk Depot, an elite inner sanctum of bureaucratic obsession, where every thread of silk belongs not to the buyer, not to the weaver, but to the state. And not just any state. This is Byzantium, where emperors wear halos and mosaics, and monopolies aren't just economic, they're theological. You wander past rows of silk bolts wrapped tightly in protective cloth, each bundle marked with a crimson wax seal and an inked sigil denoting origin, die batch, and intended use. There's a shelf just for cloths destined for the patriarch, another for the navy, yes. Even the navy had silk rank matters, even on boats. And then there's a separate velvet-lined cabinet for the imperial wardrobe, which requires special authorization to even glance at directly. Mainstream fact, the Byzantine government owned and controlled all silk production, from importation of raw cocoons to weaving and distribution. Private individuals could only buy silk that had been officially processed and taxed, often at a premium, and only after it had been inspected, registered, and in many cases, blessed. This wasn't just fashion, it was propaganda, spun by worms and dyed in imperial authority. You pause beside a massive loom, resting silently under a linen tarp. There's a tiny plaque on the wall beside it, gold lettering on dark wood. It reads, "Only authorized personnel may operate imperial pattern looms." You blink. The idea that looms required licenses feels strange until you remember you're in a world where silk declared political loyalty. And the rules get weirder. Certain patterns like the double-headed eagle or the Chi-Rho symbol were illegal to wear unless you were in the direct orbit of the emperor. Unauthorized display could result in confiscation, fines, or if worn at court, quiet exile to some place with significantly fewer cushions. Fringe detail. Some court servants were trained to spot bootleg imperial silks from across a room, purely by gauging sheen angle and thread width. One manual reportedly instructed them to look for arrogance in the light. Subtle, you move through racks of folded garments, each wrapped in beeswax cloth to protect against moths and moisture. A clerk walks past you with a bowl of sandalwood smoke, gently fanning the air near the higher shelves. Not for the silk, exactly. For the atmosphere. The depot is part storeroom, part shrine. You come across a thick scroll propped on a stand. It's the register of approved silks, cataloged by color, pattern, and usage. Some entries are practical crimson weave, borderless, designated for provincial governors. Others are almost poetic indigo-shot tapestry, meant for the back of the emperor's throne, seen only by God and the wall. Historians still argue whether this level of detail was a necessary assertion of imperial image, or just good old Byzantine overkill? Was this silk control part of a grand design to maintain visual authority? Or had the bureaucracy simply become a self-feeding machine, regulating silk because it knew no other way to feel secure? It's hard to say, but either way, it worked. For a time, because to the outside world, Arab courts, Frankish kings, Viking traders, Byzantine silk was the standard. The gold, the weave, the scent, it all whispered of divine order, perfect hierarchy, and a government with the time and audacity to weigh fabric by candlelight and chew it before approving it for sale. You linger near the exit of the depot and glance back once more. The bolts of cloth seem to shimmer slightly in the low light. Not flashy, not garish, just certain. A textile with an ego. Because when your empire is slowly shrinking, when your army is undermanned, when your borders shift weekly, you need something to remind people that the center still holds. And that something might just be silk. You step out of the depot and immediately into a smaller hallway where the walls seem to close in just slightly, like even the architecture is whispering. The air grows warmer again, filled now with a sharp mix of ink, old leather, and faint irritation. You've arrived at the domain of the inspectors, the strange elite who measured silk with their teeth. Yes, this is the room where the biting happened. You pause outside a heavy cedar door, marked not with a name, but a symbol, a stylized molar. Faintly ridiculous, yet also somehow intimidating. You nudge it open. Inside, it's quiet, peaceful, even. There are no raised voices here, no scribes clattering away at scrolls. Just a long table, some tools you don't recognize, and 4 men in robes hunched over bolts of fabric like monks inspecting relics. One of them lifts a piece of golden silk, folds it gently, then leans forward and presses it between his teeth. Not hard, just enough to feel. He holds it there for a moment, eyes closed in complete concentration, then withdraws, nods slightly, passes the cloth along. Mainstream fact: Byzantine silk inspectors, especially those in the employ of the state, often judged fabric by touch and mouthfeel, using trained sensitivity to detect forgeries, impurities, or foreign substitutes. This wasn't an eccentric habit. It was policy, and it required training. Fringe tidbit: a document from the 9th century suggests that some silk inspectors were formally tested on their sensory accuracy, asked to identify silk types by touch, sight, and oral pressure. One inspector was reportedly demoted after mistaking Armenian blend for full Constantinopolitan weave, a mistake described as texturally humiliating. You step farther into the room. One inspector, clearly senior, gives you a quick glance and gestures toward the shelf. You approach, finding rows of narrow cloth strips wrapped around small wooden rods. Each strip is labeled in delicate script: Macedonian weft, high gold content, Coptic silk, ivory dyed, uneven fringe, suspiciously soft. Investigate. It's like a wine cellar, but for fabric. One rod has a faint groove worn into the cloth's edge where it's been pressed again and again by a bureaucrat's incisors. A little absurd, a little brilliant. You watch the inspectors work. One leans in, bites gently, releases. Another pinches, rubs, flicks a small corner with his thumbnail. A third sniffs twice, with a kind of judgmental elegance, then jots a note. Historians still argue whether these oral tests were genuinely effective or merely ritualistic. Were they able to actually tell silk blends apart with their teeth? Or was this the Byzantine version of a wine sommelier bluffing their way through plum notes and hints of leather? The answer is probably both. Because in Byzantium, ceremony was part of function. If a silk's texture had been blessed, reviewed, and literally tasted by imperial agents, that made it more than cloth. It became sanctioned truth, something the empire could stand behind, or drape on its favorite bishop. And there were consequences when things went wrong. You overhear a low conversation at the far end of the table. Two inspectors, arguing softly about a bolt from Trebizond. It's been polished, one says. You can tell it sticks to the teeth too smoothly. Like oiled parchment. Send it back, the other mutters. If we approve that, the dyers will try it again next week. It's not fabric, it's diplomacy. Because approving or rejecting silk could shape entire trade agreements. Insult the wrong merchant, and you might lose access to their caravan route. Approve the wrong cloth, and suddenly Constantinople looks like it can't tell the difference between luxury and trickery. You sit quietly as another bolt is tested and logged. One inspector nibbles, then smiles. Proper weight, he says. Sings on the teeth. You're not sure what that means, but no one questions him. The others nod. And just like that, the cloth is approved for ceremonial wear. Maybe it'll end up on a robe. Maybe draped behind a saint's icon. Maybe cut and rewoven into something sacred enough that it's never washed, just perfumed and whispered over. All thanks to a little pressure, a little patience, a good set of teeth. You stand and quietly exit the room. Behind you, the inspectors continue tasting the economy, one bite at a time. You slip back into a wider corridor now, blinking a little as your eyes adjust from the dim quiet of the silk biter's den. The walls here are decorated more colorful, more performative. Stylized looms in gold ink, border patterns in endless spirals, silk moths painted with the delicacy usually reserved for saints. This is where the guilds ruled. Not loud, not flashy, but immovable. Bureaucracy may have recorded the rules, but the guilds wrote them. You turn a corner and enter a long, low hall where sunlight spills in through narrow windows. Desks are arranged in neat rows. At each one sits a representative of a silk guild, every one of them with a ledger, a small weight scale, and a face that says they haven't smiled in 3 dynasties. Welcome to the Silk Guild Registry, an institution so powerful. It made sure no thread was woven without a signature and a sigh. Mainstream fact. Byzantine silk production was tightly regulated not only by state bureaucrats but also by guilds, which operated like elite unions, each one guarding their techniques, dye recipes, and weaving patterns with something bordering on holy paranoia. You pass a woman in a dark tunic, carefully counting the threads in a finished bolt. Her fingers move like a harpist's, eyes squinting as if she's daring the cloth to try something tricky. Once she's done, she adds her approval mark, a small wax seal, stamped with her guild symbol. This bolt can now be sold, or exported, or stitched into the hem of a future emperor's 5th best parade robe. Fringe tidbit. Some guilds were so protective of their methods that apprentices were sworn to secrecy under threat of excommunication, not from the church, but from the guild itself. That might not sound terrifying until you realize guild expulsion often meant economic extinction. You stop near a display wall of official rulebooks, all bound in embossed leather. You squint at one. It reads, Rule 17. No silk shall be woven during eclipse days. Rule 32. Any deviation from authorized warp tension must be reported within 6 hours. Rule 48. No red dye shall be made using beet extract unless approved by 2 guild dye masters and a cleric. You blink. The specificity isn't just impressive, it's obsessive. One clerk nearby notices your expression and shrugs. If it's not written down, someone will do it badly, he says. Not unkindly, or worse, differently. Historians still argue whether these guild rules represented refined expertise or paranoid control mechanisms. Did they preserve high standards or just slow everything down to a crawl wrapped in red silk tape? You browse a sample rack of guild-approved fabrics. Each swatch has a tag explaining which weaver produced it, under which moon phase, and with which silk grade. There's a sample of grade 4 ceremonial crimson, damp season batch, secondary loom. You run your fingers over it. It feels like reputation. Nearby, 2 guild reps are locked in a heated but extremely polite argument over fringe density. This edge is double-looped, one insists, which is standard for monastic vestments, not merchant banners. The other leans closer. It's a temple commission from Pontus. Their priest march, a beat, then a slow nod. Marching fringe. Understood. It's absurd and completely logical, and somehow oddly beautiful. Because you realize now these people didn't just make silk. They made meaning. Every thread, every stitch, every decision, it all had a place in a layered web of tradition, symbolism, and power. You exit the hall, but not before passing a small altar tucked in a corner. It's dedicated to Saint Homonoia, the patron of civic unity. Someone has laid a folded bolt of gold-threaded silk at the base, tied with a simple ribbon. A guild offering, perhaps, or just a prayer for a season with fewer dye disputes. You walk back into the sunlight, squinting slightly. The city bustles beyond these halls, but in here, time moves slower. Because guilds didn't chase trends. They built rules. And then they defended those rules like siege walls. The air shifts as you step out from the guild registry and into a narrow passage that twists toward the less decorative, more nervous end of the bureaucracy. Gone are the neat desks and wax seals. Here the stone walls are bare, the torches low, the silence almost performative. This is where silk stops being just a commodity and starts being a state secret. You walk slowly past a shuttered window where 2 scribes are talking in hushed tones, their voices just above a whisper, as though the scrolls themselves might snitch. One holds up a sample of cloth and says, "This isn't from here. Welcome to the world of spy silk." Mainstream fact. Byzantine officials were so concerned about foreign silk infiltrating the empire and undermining the imperial monopoly that they maintained a bureaucratic surveillance network trained to sniff out contraband threads. Yes, really. You step into a room marked Department of Textile Compliance, Western Trade Routes. Inside, shelves bulge with confiscated cloth, some rolled, some folded, some awkwardly jammed into jars of scented oil, either for preservation or just bureaucratic flair. A guard watches the door. A clerk behind the desk gestures for you to come closer. On the table lies a piece of shimmering blue fabric. It looks innocent enough, but the clerk shakes his head solemnly. "Syrian blend," he says, tapping the edge. "Smuggled through Antioch." They try to pass it off as Constantinopolitan. But see here. He lifts a corner. The weft is too loose. The gold thread's too thick. It smells faintly of, he sniffs, juniper. They think we wouldn't notice. Fringe tidbit. Some silk inspectors were trained to identify origin by scent, especially when silk was dyed with regional plant mixtures. There are whispered stories of a blind inspector who could identify 24 dye origins with a single whiff. He was known, without irony, as the nose of the East. You glance around the room. On one shelf is a sealed basket marked Evidence, Second Trial of Miletos, and beside it, a scroll outlining the confiscation of 3 bolts of illegal purple silk wrapped inside amphorae labeled olive oil. Creative, but not good enough. Because the empire had a lot to lose. Silk wasn't just cloth, it was a political currency, a symbol of power, a tool of diplomacy. If foreign silk slipped in, the emperor's monopoly weakened. If counterfeit silks got used in court robes, legitimacy frayed, quite literally. Historians still argue whether these spy networks were large-scale operations or more like an anxious handful of textile detectives sniffing suspicious cloaks in alleyways. Either way, the records don't lie. There were trials, interrogations, and confiscations tied directly to unauthorized silk. You step into an adjoining room where 2 clerks are gently unraveling a suspect bolt. Layer by layer, using fine ivory tools and an air of exaggerated disappointment. Every few inches, they stop, make a note, or sigh deeply. This is a silk autopsy. It was woven to mimic Eastern dye lots. One explains without looking up, but it's missing the imperial spin signature. You ask if that's something visible. He shakes his head. No, you feel it. On the tongue. You don't ask for clarification. Further down the hall is a wall of parchments showing silk pattern sketches labeled with bright red X marks. Each one is a known counterfeit, carefully drawn and described. Some are close. One even fooled an archbishop. Temporarily. The scribe who flagged it was rewarded with a robe and an extra bean ration for 3 months. Because in Byzantium, catching fake silk wasn't just your job. It was a public service, and occasionally a political weapon. You hear whispers of a scandal from just last year. An ambitious courtier accused his rival of wearing unsanctioned Armenian silk to an imperial banquet. A full investigation followed. The accused was found innocent, but the resulting bureaucratic chaos left 3 ministries arguing over the legal definition of shimmer. You leave the compliance offices with a strange mixture of awe and disbelief. Who else but the Byzantines could make fabric feel like espionage? Because this wasn't just thread, it was trust. And someone, somewhere, was always testing the weave. You step back into the brighter corridors now. The spy-laced paranoia of counterfeit silks fading behind you, but the scent of regulation still clings to the air, like old ink and new tension. And what lies ahead is not less strange, only better lit. Because now, we enter a moment of petty glory in Byzantine silk history. A moment that begins not with war, nor with theology, but with the gold thread tax scandal of 692. You follow the polished mosaic tiles under your feet as they lead you toward the Imperial Treasury Annex, a place that's part accounting office, part sacred vault, and part giant whispering chamber of bureaucratic doom. There are guards. Of course, see, more decorative than functional, but they stand like statues, eyes glazed over from years of watching people count thread by the cubit. Inside the annex, clerks pace slowly between long wooden tables covered in stacked fabrics, coins, and tightly rolled financial documents tied with crimson cords. You stop at one table labeled Precious Threads, East Section, and notice a bundle of glittering silk marked with a wax seal that reads, Plainly withheld pending tax inquiry. Mainstream fact. In 692 AD, under Emperor Justinian II, a surtax was imposed on gold-threaded silk, sparking outrage among both merchants and court tailors. The empire, in its eternal quest to fund wars and build more domes, decided that shimmering wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a taxable luxury. The backlash mild rebellion in the provinces, trade guild protests, and one cleric who allegedly refused to wear a new robe on Easter as a form of protest, saying, "The shimmer is of man, not of God." Fringe Tidbit. A satirical poem from the time describes a low-level official sneaking into a treasury storeroom and clipping slivers of gold thread from unused robes, winding them into tiny balls and smuggling them out in his sandals. He was caught when someone noticed his walk had too much dignity for his rank. You run your hand along a ledger left open on a podium. The entries are meticulous. 3 bolts of crimson weave, taxed at 6 nomismata per L. 1 bolt of double gold trim, rejected for excessive shimmer. 1 imperial robe held for reassessment following suspicious brightness. Suspicious brightness? You pause. Someone's entire afternoon must have hinged on debating how sparkly was too sparkly. Historians still argue whether this tax was a clever fiscal policy or an absurd overreach of the Byzantine love for control. Some say it stabilized the treasury. Others believe it led to increased black market shimmer, with smugglers mixing fake gold into thread to bypass levies. And it didn't just affect tailors. Diplomats complained. Robes for foreign envoys had to be recalibrated to ensure they didn't violate domestic tax law while still looking fabulous abroad. The Bureau of Ceremonial Gift Consistency, yes, that was real, was forced to rewrite entire inventory lists because 2 shipments to the Abbasid Caliphate had differing visual impressiveness. One poor junior accountant, assigned to silk imports, reportedly developed stress hives from trying to categorize a batch of thread that contained silver-gold alloy, leading to the infamous "is it gold enough" inquiry that consumed 3 scrolls and a formal apology from the Weavers Guild. You glance at a garment on display in a sealed case, a half-finished robe with gold thread trim, curled neatly along the hem. A little card reads, "Rejected. Excess shimmer per inch exceeded." The tragedy. You chuckle softly, but you also understand, in Byzantium, everything meant something. Every thread had consequences. Every sparkle was a statement, and sometimes a scandal. You step outside the annex and take a breath. The sun hits a silken banner fluttering on the tower above you, dull by modern standards. But you now know just how much effort it took to make it that dull on purpose. A triumph of taste, a win for bureaucracy, a shimmering compromise between beauty and balance, and somehow a tax form. You move away from the Treasury Annex, the scandal of over-shimmering thread still bouncing around in your mind like a wayward bead, and head toward the one place in Constantinople where silk wasn't just checked, taxed, or sniffed, it was worn. Not occasionally, not politely, but lavishly, constantly, excessively. You're going to the wardrobe. Not your wardrobe, not even a royal walk-in closet. You're heading to the official Byzantine Imperial Vestiarium, the Imperial Dressing Chamber and Textile Treasury, where emperors were robed like gods and robe politics could literally shape dynasties. The corridor darkens briefly as you step beneath an arch. Then you emerge into a hall painted top to bottom in soft red ochre. The floors laid with tessellated patterns meant to mimic flowing robes underfoot. There are no windows here. Light streams in from skylights above, creating a glowing, golden hush. And in the center of the room, behind polished cedar screens, stands a long bronze rack with over 200 robes, each one more outrageous than the last. Mainstream fact: Byzantine emperors possessed an immense collection of ceremonial garments, most of which were categorized by rank, season, event type, and even time of day. One inventory from the 10th century lists at least 217 official robes, not including capes, belts, gloves, or hats. Or you step closer to one, the robe of reception, a shimmering purple beast embroidered with tiny lions, griffins, and an entire procession of saints stitched in gold. Another nearby is labeled third-tier public mourning garment, because yes, even grief had a dress code. One court servant glides past you carrying a feather duster and the air of someone who knows exactly how much each of these garments could bankrupt a monastery. And then the one you've been waiting for, the chrysotrachlinos robe worn during the most formal imperial ceremonies. You lean in. The fabric is so dense with gold thread it practically hums. Tiny pearls line the collar, and on the back, there's an embroidered medallion of Christ Pantocrator flanked by what you think might be angry-looking ducks. Symbolism, you assume. Or maybe a cautionary tale? Fringe tidbit. A late 9th century document records a servant being reprimanded for misplacing one of the emperor's 12 near-identical purple slippers. Each had different bead arrangements meant for specific events. The mistake caused a slight delay in the emperor's entrance and was recorded as a minor ceremonial catastrophe. You read a wall placard that explains how garments were rotated seasonally and rested between appearances to preserve their shimmer. Some robes were scented with spiced oils. Others were wrapped in violet cloth to avoid overexposure to light. One, absurdly, was kept underwater in a sealed stone basin to maintain its color saturation. It probably didn't work, but the ritual was what mattered. Historians still argue whether the size of the emperor's wardrobe was a genuine expression of state strength or simply a manifestation of ceremonial anxiety. Was it power in cloth form or a desperate need to literally wear legitimacy? Because in Byzantium, the clothes didn't just make the man. They made the empire. You glance down a corridor leading to the emperor's robing chamber off limits. Of course, unless you're part of the elite kubuklesioi, the robe attendants. These men weren't just dressers. They were trusted confidants who controlled access to the emperor. If they didn't like you, your audience was delayed. If they did, you might get bumped up the procession. A robe could advance your career or ruin your reputation. You lean against a column and look back at the racks. The weight of symbolism here is heavy, not just in thread count, but in meaning. Purple silk said, "God chose me." White said, "I'm pure enough to rule." Black said, "I mourn what you never understood." And all of it, every last sleeve and hem, was managed by the very same bureaucrats who once bit silk in back rooms by candlelight. You exhale, it's just cloth, and yet it isn't. It's imperial identity, woven tight, a moving mosaic, a whispering robe, a shimmer with consequences. You walk slowly now, as though silk has crept into your bones, slowing your step and straightening your spine. The air has that heavy stillness you find in libraries or courtrooms or, fittingly, a very serious tailor's fitting room. Because you're leaving the closet of emperors and stepping into the realm where fashion itself was dangerous. That's right. Tonight, you learn how wearing the wrong sleeve could end your career. You pass beneath another painted archway, this one decorated with little mosaic rosettes that look suspiciously like buttons. The hallway here is lined with frescoes of court events, coronations, audiences, feast days, and in each scene, the clothing is alarmingly uniform. Every figure is dressed exactly according to rank, office, and occasion. No creativity, no flair, no room for mistakes. Mainstream fact in the Byzantine court. Dress codes were brutally specific. Protocol dictated not only the color and type of fabric you wore, but also the cut, length, and ornamentation. A sleeve a little too long. A hem stitched with the wrong border pattern. That was enough to be seen as presumptuous, or worse, treasonous cosplay. You find yourself in a gallery filled with actual garments laid flat under glass, labeled with dignified little cards, a deep red robe with minimal trim for provincial governors, third-rank banquets, a heavy blue tunic embroidered with vine motifs, acceptable only for widowed noblewomen during Lenten observances. One display shows a robe with a missing border, tagged retired after the wearer was found, impersonating a prepositus sacri cubiculi chief palace attendant. Demoted to grain inventory supervision? Fringe tidbit. There's record of an unfortunate eunuch who wore a gold-bordered sash outside the imperial palace, an accessory reserved strictly for ceremonies inside the Chrysotriklinos. The result, a public apology, a dock in pay, and what was described as 2 very cold months of silence from his superiors. And yet, this wasn't about vanity. In Byzantium, what you wore communicated exactly who you were in the celestial ladder of power. It was a visual script, a living flowchart. Step out of line with your embroidery, and people wouldn't just think you were unfashionable, and they'd think you were deliberately challenging imperial order. Historians still argue whether these dress regulations were enforced mainly to preserve status hierarchy or to prevent political uprisings disguised as fashion statements. But either way, the results were clear. Clothing became a form of controlled expression, a language where every color and cuff was a clause. You pass a mural of a state audience, its figures frozen mid-procession. In the foreground, an imperial cousin approaches the throne, head bowed, robe perfectly aligned. Behind him, a trembling official whose belt pattern has one too many gold threads. You don't need a caption to know which one got promoted. And then there were the colors. Purple, of course, was the sacred hue, reserved for the emperor and immediate heirs. Even touching it without permission could lead to confiscation of property, or an uncomfortable invitation to explain yourself in a quiet chamber. Blue meant high office. Green meant imperial favor. Brown meant I used to be somebody. You spot a scroll nailed to the wall in a glass case? It's a Byzantine sartorial directive, issued by Emperor Constantine VII. Let no man of second-class rank presume to wear gold thread on his outer garment, unless specifically blessed by the logothete of the wardrobe. Let no tunic rise above the calf if the wearer's station be lower than Magister Militum. Let all know that disobedience in dress reflects disobedience in spirit. You smile, imagining someone pulling a robe from their closet and squinting. Was this for Wednesdays or embassy receptions? And does this count as gold if it's just really shiny yellow? Still, the rules were real. And people followed them partly out of respect, partly out of fear, and partly because you never knew who was watching. You turn and catch sight of a small carved bench near the exit. It's marked with a single phrase, "All garments are declarations." And so they were. In Byzantium, fashion was a form of governance. Your clothes were your resume, your passport. Your resume again, but this time embroidered. Because here in a style wasn't expression. It was structure. You step out from the echo of polished hems and gold-trimmed emotions and into the quieter, cooler galleries of memory. This part of the palace feels older, less polished, more lived in. The walls are darker. The tile underfoot is scuffed and uneven. The silk banners here are faded, their threads slack, like they've exhaled centuries of ceremony and finally decided to relax. You've arrived at a quieter truth, one stitched not into garments but into history itself. Because tonight, you get to watch how silk helped Byzantium outlive Rome. Not just through fashion or taxes, or biting quality control, but through reputation, ritual, and a stunning refusal to unravel. You settle beside a small stone bench where a painted map spreads across the wall, the Mediterranean in blues and terracottas. Tiny ships dotting the sea, with Constantinople gleaming like a gold coin at the center. It's a reminder this was the city that didn't fall. Not when the West did. Mainstream fact. After the Western Roman Empire crumbled in the 5th century, the eastern half, what we now call Byzantium, survived nearly another 1,000 years. And silk played no small role in that miracle. You turn a corner and find a long glass case containing a robe, not bright or elaborate, but sturdy, practical. This is a diplomatic robe, the kind sent abroad as a gift to foreign rulers. It's labeled, worn by emissaries of the emperor to the court of Charlemagne, 812 AD. You look closer. The cloth is finely woven but restrained just enough shimmer to impress, not enough to threaten. Because that was the genius. Byzantium understood that perception was power. Fringe tidbit. The Byzantines were so precise with their diplomatic silk gifts that they sometimes altered the thread count, depending on the recipient's importance. An ally got a high count weave. A potential threat got something a little coarser, subtle, controlled, intentional. You walk past a mural depicting a foreign envoy kneeling before the emperor, arms outstretched. In his hands, a tribute. At his feet, a robe laid out for inspection. Behind him, the imperial court silent, shining, and watching. Historians still argue whether this use of silk diplomacy was a calculated economic strategy or a more deeply cultural belief that textile elegance reflected divine favor. Either way, it worked. Byzantium maintained influence across continents, not just with soldiers or silver, but with robes. You pause before a niche in the wall where several fragments of silk have been preserved in clay, pulled from the tombs of ambassadors, bishops, and elite merchants. Some show the imperial eagle. Others bear intricate knotwork in crimson and black. All of them tell the same story. This came from the center of the world, because that's what Constantinople became. The silken heart of empire. While Rome burned and Gaul fractured, the Byzantines stitched, bit, and stamped their way through chaos one bolt of cloth at a time. And the silk didn't just reinforce borders, it defined them. Trade routes bent toward Constantinople like silk threads drawn to a loom. Merchants came from Baghdad, Venice, Kiev, even China, not to conquer, but to trade, to petition, to ask for a little shimmer to carry back home. Even enemies respected the silk. There's a legend, probably exaggerated, possibly true, that when a Persian general captured a Byzantine officer in battle, he spared him after discovering the man's robes were imperial-issue diplomatic weave. Anyone trusted with cloth like this, he allegedly said, is worth more alive. You wander toward a side alcove where another map shows trade routes radiating from the city like sunbeams, roads, rivers, and sea lanes all humming with silken traffic. Some bolts were traded for grain, others for influence. A few were given in marriage contracts so rich they required their own scribes. This was silk not as fashion, not even as fabric. This was strategy, diplomacy you could wear. 1,000-year defense policy with embroidery? You turn back to the robe in the glass. It doesn't glitter, it doesn't shout, but it hums with something else. Something Byzantium understood long before its rivals. Power doesn't have to be loud. Sometimes it just has to be woven carefully. You exit the diplomatic gallery and emerge once more into the sunlight, though you suspect the Byzantines would have preferred to keep even daylight on a leash if they could have documented it properly. Ahead of you, through an arched passage flanked by lion-faced waterspouts, lies a small courtyard paved in mismatched stone and shaded by 3 aging mulberry trees. Yes, mulberries. The only fruit that mattered when your empire ran on silk. You sit beneath one of the trees, the leaves whispering gently above you, and begin to trace the tale backward to silk's origin, which, for Byzantium, was less about fashion and far more about espionage with larvae. Mainstream fact for centuries. The Byzantine Empire had to import silk from China via Persia, an expensive, delicate, and politically vulnerable trade route. That is, until the 6th century, when 2 Byzantine monks smuggled silkworm eggs into the empire. Hidden inside hollowed-out bamboo walking staffs, you lean back against the trunk and imagine it 2 unassuming holy men. Part of a quiet diplomatic mission, shuffling past border checkpoints with innocent expressions and wildly illegal insects tucked into their luggage. Fringe detail. Some sources claim the monks carried mulberry seeds too, knowing full well that silkworms can't survive without their one and only food source. It wasn't just an act of smuggling. It was an act of complete ecological hijacking. The risk was enormous. Discovery could have meant execution. Silk production was a Chinese state secret, guarded as fiercely as any military strategy. But the monks made it back. The eggs were hatched, the worms fed. And by the mid-6th century, Byzantium had gone from silk importer to silk sovereign. You rise from the bench and wander toward a shaded portico nearby, where a reconstructed sericulture room lies open to the public. Inside are trays of cocoons, long-handled brushes, and small oil lamps used to maintain warmth for the fussy little producers. A plaque reads, "All glory to the worms." Probably not a joke. Historians still argue whether the story of the monks is literally true or just imperial propaganda. But the evidence for sudden local silk production, right after years of reliance on foreign supply, suggests something very bold happened. Whether or not the staffs were bamboo, something was definitely smuggled. And it changed everything. You pause beside a weaving station where mulberry bark has been mashed and fermented into dye. The scent is sweet, sour, and faintly fungal. A weaver nearby hums softly as he threads newly spun silk onto a loom motion slow. Practiced, reverent. This is where the empire began to control the whole process. No more reliance on Persian routes. No more vulnerable trade deals. No more middlemen biting off a cut of Byzantium's golden reputation. Now the silk came from inside the empire. And with that shift came a complete reorganization. Sericulture zones were established, worm farms regulated, breeding controlled. There were inspectors not just for the finished cloth, but for the worms themselves. If your batch underperformed, the logothete of agriculture wanted to know why. You pass a stone carving on the wall showing 2 monks offering what looks like a cocoon to Emperor Justinian. His face is unreadable, but the plaque below is more generous. The moment Byzantium swallowed the worm. And with it, the empire gained something more precious than gold self-sufficiency. Because this wasn't just economics. This was independence by thread. Byzantium now had the ability to control image, diplomacy, and tradition from larva to liturgy. Fringe Tidbit 1 report claims the monks were rewarded not with gold, but with an estate in the countryside where silkworms could breed undisturbed. It was called the Quiet Thread. No one's sure if it existed, but it absolutely should have. You step back into the sun and look up through the leaves. A silkworm would see the sky through this same green lattice, would munch, would spin, would leave behind a legacy that would outlast emperors. You smile, because silk may have shimmered in palaces, but it all started with a worm and a lie. The courtyard behind you fades into soft shadow as you step back inside the palace complex, through a narrow, arched door barely tall enough for anyone wearing ceremonial headgear. The cool air wraps around you like a silk robe appropriate, considering where you're headed now. Because while emperors wore silk, monks smuggled silk, and bureaucrats bit silk, there came a point in history when those very same bureaucrats started to turn against it. You descend a short staircase, the stone stairs worn smooth by centuries of sandals and soft complaints. At the bottom, a long, low chamber opens before you, walls lined with scroll cubbies, all labeled with the dry precision of someone who hasn't seen sunlight in decades. Welcome to the administrative twilight, the point in Byzantine silk history where the cloth that once held the empire together started to fray the patience of the very people managing it. You find a heavy ledger laid open on a marble table. It's a complaint log. Yes, they had those, and not a small one either. Dozens of neat lines written in increasingly impatient handwriting. Shipment from Thessalonica delayed due to warp calibration dispute. Again, weavers at the Lemnian workshop refused to standardize gold thread twist. Recommend censure. 3 more clerks bitten by silkworms. Stop storing cocoons in tax record room. Mainstream fact. As silk production scaled across the empire, so too did the administrative complexity. The once noble process of managing a luxury monopoly became a bureaucratic nightmare involving price controls, labor disputes, quality enforcement, and personality clashes between departments. You pause beside a display showing correspondence between 2 silk officials. The first letter is polite. In future, please ensure red-dyed bolts from the Smyrna region are stamped before transport. It is confusing to find unstamped shimmer in the customs hold. The reply is less polite. If the Constantinopolitan office prefers stamped shimmer, perhaps they should attend their own dye vats instead of critiquing ours from a reclined position. Fringe tidbit. There are references to interdepartmental feuds between silk inspectors and dye supervisors, with accusations ranging from intentional thread slippage to perfume sabotage. One memo ends with the glorious line, "I will not take color advice from a man who once approved yellow trim for an autumn robe." It would be funny if it weren't deadly serious, because all these arguments slowed down production, delayed diplomatic shipments, annoyed foreign envoys. And worse, they shook the one thing Byzantium valued most, the illusion of seamlessness. Historians still argue whether this bureaucratic breakdown marked the beginning of real structural decline in the imperial textile monopoly, or if it was just typical Byzantine infighting. After all, this was an empire famous for writing 50-page memos about whether doves should be woven into or onto ecclesiastical curtains. The answer naturally depended on rank. You walk past a low bench where a slightly dramatic display has been set up a velvet robe. Cut down the middle. On one half, the cloth is rich, intact, gleaming. On the other, frayed threads, faded color, and a note reading, "Rejected by the Silken Accounts Office, AD 1011 due to pattern inconsistency and visible tension in seams." Visible tension, indeed. You notice a quote etched on the wall nearby. It's attributed to an overworked registrar named Macarian. Let the emperor have his shimmer. Let the bishops have their thread. But may the saints protect us from another meeting about buttonhole placement. You smile? Because it's not hard to imagine these officials, trapped in rooms lit by oil lamps and the flickering doubt that maybe, just maybe, silk had gotten out of hand. And yet, none of them quit. None of them tore down the system. Because underneath the irritation was something deeper belief in the ritual. They didn't like how hard it was, but they understood why it mattered. And so they kept filing, kept biting, kept regulating a fabric that had long ago stopped being a textile and become a theology of cloth. You take a final glance around the room, the parchments, the petty grievances, the shredded patience, and step quietly back into the corridor. Behind you, another clerk sighs and reaches for a quill. Some things never change. The corridor opens now into a more ornate wing of the palace, a place where the floor gleams from obsessive sweeping. The incense is stronger, and the silence is heavy with both luxury and secrets. You pass guards in plum-colored tunics who barely glance at you. They've seen everything except perhaps what's hidden in this next room. You step inside a small chamber lined with velvet drapes and low benches. A fire crackles softly at the far end. On the wall, a series of painted panels showing judges, defendants, witnesses, and bolts of fabric. Because here in Byzantium, silk didn't just go to court. It was the court case. Tonight, you're entering the world of silken bribes and courtroom drama. Mainstream fact. Byzantine legal records show that silk robes were often used as bribes, gifts, or unsolicited tokens of goodwill in court cases. Judges were supposed to resist. Some did, others less so. You approach a display in the center of the room. It features a judge's chair carved with lions' heads, and beside it, a mannequin dressed in the robes of a krites, a provincial magistrate. The accompanying plaque is surprisingly honest position required impartiality, discipline, and a complete lack of robe envy. You turn toward a glass case containing a bundle of legal scrolls tied with a crimson ribbon. One is open and annotated. A note in the margin reads, "Defendant presented a robe of unusually fine quality. Trial postponed for ceremonial reconsideration." Ceremonial reconsideration. Of course. Fringe tidbit. One particularly juicy trial from 943 AD involved a merchant accused of overcharging clergy for imported damask. His defense attorney reportedly arrived in a robe gifted by the merchant himself, shimmering so brightly it allegedly distracted the notary into forgetting the charges. No one was convicted. You wander over to a diorama showing a courtroom in full swing figures, frozen mid-gesture, cloth laid out on a central table like evidence. A pair of silk inspectors, yes. The biters stand to one side, giving testimony on thread density while a priest scowls from behind a podium. Historians still argue whether silk influenced verdicts directly, or if its presence merely guided judgment by reminding the judges of status, generosity, or softness. But consider this: Byzantine law was layered, intricate, and designed to reflect heavenly order. In that mindset, silk wasn't just temptation, it was a kind of moral barometer. If you wore it well, gave it generously, respected its codes, you might be perceived as virtuous. Even if your merchant records were incomplete. You glance at another scroll. It records a robe being used as bail. Not coins, not land deeds, just a robe, embroidered, high quality, and presumably well known enough that court officials accepted it as collateral. Further down the wall, a painting shows an accused noblewoman presenting a folded garment to the court, not for herself, but for the judge's wife. An early version of "I'm not trying to sway you, but she's going to love this trim." You sit for a moment on a stone bench, half amused, half amazed. Because in Byzantium, the justice system didn't just wear robes, it was woven into them. Fringe theory. Some scholars believe that this blur between law and fabric wasn't corruption, but ritualized generosity, a way of honoring the court's importance through material reverence. A silk gift wasn't always a bribe. Sometimes it was just a very shiny thank you card. Still, records suggest at least 5 trials were paused due to robe-related influences. One was delayed because a judge wanted time to verify the weave. Another was suspended when the defendant arrived in a robe nicer than the emperor's cousins, and someone took offense. You rise and walk slowly toward the exit. Behind you, the crackling fire glows softly. The walls shimmer faintly with woven banners from old trials, now half faded, half legend. And you realize in a society where meaning lived in fabric, the courtroom was never neutral. It was a stage, and every robe was an argument. You emerge from the silk-stained court chamber with the distinct impression that, in Byzantium, even guilt could be hemmed in gold. The corridor ahead opens into a grand salon. Quieter now. Less about robes that dazzled in the courtroom, and more about the ones that quietly shaped power outside of it. Because tonight, you meet someone whose fingers never held a sword, but whose needle rewrote politics thread by thread. A woman with 1,000 needles. You step into a tall, airy hall. Its ceiling painted with stars and its walls lined with tapestry panels. Each one glows faintly with age and status. Robes, borders, cuffs, sleeves, most of them unsigned. But tucked in the far corner of the gallery is a name. Just one. Theodora of Salimbria, silk mistress, court embroiderer, and, if the rumors are true, unofficial advisor to more than one very nervous emperor. Mainstream fact: Byzantine women played essential roles in silk production, not only as weavers and dyers, but also as embroidery masters, responsible for adding the final touches to the most sacred and powerful garments in the empire. These women often worked in female-only monastic workshops, places of spiritual retreat and staggering economic output. But Theodora, she didn't stay cloistered. You approach a display showing a robe fragment attributed to her hand, a square of deep blue silk, embroidered with tiny lions so precise they look painted. Below it, a bronze plaque reads, "Completed for the coronation of Constantine VII, 913 AD, edged by Theodora of Salimbria." What the plaque doesn't mention is that she also allegedly smuggled messages into her embroidery. Tiny imperfections. Stitch counts that meant something. Golden vine patterns shaped like imperial monograms, shifted subtly to signal allegiance, affection, or warning. Fringe tidbit. One particularly controversial robe bore a border pattern shaped like flames, not a traditional motif. When questioned, Theodora reportedly replied, "Some rulers are crowned with fire before they feel its heat. The emperor wore it anyway." You read excerpts from court records nearby. Theodora's name appears more than once. Sometimes with praise, she preserves the old dignity. Sometimes with suspicion, she embroiders faster than reports can be verified. And once cryptically, she sees what the robes will witness. Because she was there. Always in the room. At the final moment. Draping the robe on the shoulders of men who were about to become either icons or exiles. A stitch here. A hidden message there. A whispered word. Like, hold your chin up. This color is seen by God. Historians still argue whether women like Theodora wielded real political power or merely symbolic influence. But in Byzantium, where symbols became law, influence through embroidery was influence all the same. You sit beside a case displaying her toolkit, tiny bronze needles, bone bobbins, skeins of dyed thread kept in glass tubes to prevent fading. Everything elegant, everything sharp. There's a scroll under glass, a letter written to Theodora by a mid-level court official, begging for a favor. Not money, not protection, Just a robe, a gift for his daughter's wedding, with one vine in gold. If your hand allows. She never replied. But the robe still exists, and the vine is there. Because sometimes her silence said more than thread. You walk through the rest of the gallery slowly. Each robe has a story, each stitch, a sentence. You wonder how many whispered decisions were sewn quietly behind closed curtains, how many alliances, how many warnings. One final tapestry shows the coronation of a young emperor. Everyone's eyes are on the throne, but not Theodora's. She's embroidered in the background, head tilted, needle midair, looking not at the emperor, but at you, as if to say power doesn't speak. It stitches. You leave Theodora's hall behind with the faintest shimmer of unease still on your skin. Not fear exactly, just that prickling sensation of realizing that power can live in places you weren't watching. Behind curtains, beneath cuffs, between threads. You follow a narrow corridor, quieter now. The air heavier, the walls sweat faintly from the heat outside, and ahead just past an iron gate kept ajar by a stack of folded linen weights, a room few dare to enter without gloves, incense, or strong opinions. The room of the ceremonial robes that no one could wash. Yes, the robes that were so holy, so irreplaceable, so layered in divine narrative, they weren't allowed to touch soap or water, or sometimes even direct sunlight. You step inside. The space is dark, cool, and meticulously arranged. Each robe rests inside a cedar case lined with blue cloth. The air smells of myrrh, beeswax, and that rich, dense perfume that only ancient fabric soaked in centuries of incense can carry. Mainstream fact. Certain imperial and ecclesiastical garments in Byzantium were considered too sacred to clean. Instead of washing, they were perfumed, fanned, aired, and on rare occasion buried when they became too fragile. Why? Because they weren't clothes. They were holy relics. One case holds a tattered but still luminous robe of state deep violet, trimmed in gold thread. The shoulders embroidered with crosses so worn they seem to hover above the cloth rather than rest on it. A label reads, "Last worn in procession before the iconoclast crisis, 726 AD, unwashed, preserved by scenting and prayer." You raise an eyebrow. Preserved by prayer. Fringe tidbit. There are written records describing priests waving censers of perfume around sacred robes while chanting psalms as a form of ritual purification. One report says a robe once began to fray and was declared to be rejecting mortal restoration. It was quietly retired and buried, with honors. You walk past another robe folded neatly in a glass tray. Its purple is now more brown than royal, but its trim still gleams under the lamplight. A scroll beside it explains that no one dared repair it for fear of changing the original intention of the threads. Imagine being that important. But it's not just superstition. These garments were linked to ceremony, and ceremony was linked to heaven. To alter, clean, or refresh them casually was to risk interrupting divine alignment. Historians still argue whether this reverence was a practical measure for fabric preservation or an elevated form of imperial myth-making. But in a world where the emperor was God's chosen vessel, it made perfect sense that his robe would be more sacred than washable. You pass a cabinet that holds folded cuffs and mantles, each labeled with the exact number of times it had been worn, how long it had been exposed to incense, and which chants had been sung in its presence. One cloak had reportedly been worn only on days when two specific stars aligned and never outside a single corridor of the palace. Yes, a corridor-specific cloak. You let that sink in. You chuckle softly as you notice one exhibit titled, ceremonial boots of the golden staircase, removed immediately after the third step. But beneath the absurdity is awe, because here were garments that held memory, reverence, and rank. They weren't cleaned because they weren't common. They weren't fixed because they weren't broken. They existed beyond utility. You stop before a final display. A single robe, so fragile it's laid flat in glass, lit only by a candle and a prayer. It's thin now, see-through in places. The gold thread is faint, but it still holds shape, still tells a story. A sign says it was never worn. It was meant for a coronation that never happened. The prince died of illness. The robe was sealed in cedar, and it has never moved. Not washed, not touched, just remembered. You breathe deeply. You don't smell decay. You smell ritual, a kind of unwashed holiness, a fabric that believes even if no one wears it anymore. And you realize these garments weren't built to last. They were built to echo. You step quietly out of the chamber of never-washed robes, blinking against the shift in air. It's warmer here, drier, with a faint sweetness that doesn't quite match incense or wax. Something more floral. Something intentional. And then it hits you. You're not just breathing air, you're breathing status. Welcome to the Byzantine scent economy, where silk wasn't just about shimmer or stitch count, it was about how it smelled. You wander into a salon lined with bronze trays, clay jars, and glass vials. The floor is inlaid with tiny mosaic perfume bottles, and the air is thick with centuries of cinnamon, frankincense, rosewater, and something you suspect is ancient patchouli. Because in Byzantium, the scent of your silk mattered sometimes as much as the silk itself. Mainstream fact. Fragrance played a major role in Byzantine society, especially at court. Garments were not only judged by appearance but also by their smell, with elaborate rituals for perfuming robes depending on rank, occasion, and spiritual significance. One display here shows a rank chart carved into ivory, listing the scents appropriate to each court level. Gold myrrh oil reserved for emperors and their direct kin. Rosewater and saffron acceptable for high clergy and elite scholars. Cypress and laurel smoke used to scent legal robes for calm authority. Allegedly, cedar vinegar blend standard for low officials and people who had committed minor offenses but still had to look nice. You laugh, but it's real. You pass a scroll containing a formal complaint from a provincial bishop whose robe had been mistakenly perfumed with merchant-grade jasmine, a mistake that nearly caused a diplomatic incident. Fringe tidbit. At least one surviving ritual manual contains a section titled The Perfumed Index, a checklist used by dressing attendants to ensure robes were scented correctly before public appearances. Any deviation from the index could result in delay, demotion, or whispered scandal. And if you think that's excessive, consider this: at some point in the 10th century, a robe actually became illegal to wear after being perfumed too richly for the rank of its owner. The ruling said it was olfactorily deceitful. Historians still argue whether this scent-based stratification reflected genuine religious symbolism or simply reinforced power hierarchies through expensive smells. But either way, the outcome was clear: you were what you wore. And what you wore was what you smelled like. You approach a mannequin dressed in court attire. A note beside it reads, "Replica robe of the logothete of the Genicon, perfumed with cassia and clove water, worn during fiscal hearings." Imagine entering a tax office today where everyone smells like gently roasted oranges and theological tension. In a side alcove, a shelf displays perfume-making tools, pestles for grinding resins, copper stills for extracting oils, and a recipe scroll marked with faded fingerprints and 2 flour smudges. One entry reads, "For the emperor's morning robe, 1 part rose oil, 1 part olive distillate, 2 drops myrrh, waved over heated silk before sunrise, never stirred clockwise. Do not whisper near it." Of course not. Whispering causes imbalance. Obviously. You find a quiet bench and sit beneath a hanging scroll inscribed with an old proverb. The nose remembers what the eye forgets. And you believe it, because in Byzantium, memory was multisensory. You weren't just remembered by how you ruled or what you said. You were remembered by how your robe moved, how your trim shimmered, how your cuffs curled, and yes, how your presence perfumed the air behind you, a silken cloud that lingered after your footsteps, a signal even in absence. You close your eyes and breathe in, and suddenly, it's all there: diplomatic processions scented with citrus, courtroom robes laced with frankincense, an old woman's hands steeped in lavender oil as she embroiders fate into a collar. You rise slowly and walk back into the corridor, the scent following like a quiet echo. Because in Byzantium, fragrance wasn't vanity. It was a vocabulary. You walk on faintly perfumed, faintly dazed. The corridor narrows. The tiles warm underfoot. The silence deepens. For a brief moment, it's easy to believe that the empire isn't gone at all, that it just slipped behind a curtain somewhere, waiting to be summoned with the right robe, the right scent, or the right whisper. And then, just as you round a corner, you hear it. Applause. Well, not real applause. Painted applause. Carved applause. Murals and reliefs and glittering tiles frozen in a scene that's part theater, part politics, part fabric exhibition. This is Byzantine Fashion Week, and yes, that was a thing. Sort of, you step into the ceremonial hall of appearances, where emperors and empresses unveiled new official garments in displays that walked a line between runway, ritual, and religious reenactment. Rows of noblemen and foreign envoys would gather. Horns would sound. Curtains would part. And then, out they would come. Robes, mantles, boots, crowns. Accessories so heavy they required multiple attendants just to move naturally. Mainstream fact: the Byzantine court orchestrated public displays of new ceremonial garments, lavish unveilings that functioned both as fashion shows and as deeply symbolic affirmations of imperial order. These weren't random outfits. They were statements of power, hierarchy, and divine right. You stare up at a mosaic showing Emperor Leo VI stepping forward in a new purple and gold robe. The hem edged with pearls, the sleeves flared and embroidered with tiny archangels. His expression is serene, his robe glorious. The crowd around him enthralled and possibly terrified to blink incorrectly. Fringe tidbit: one 11th century chronicler claims that an empress once fainted mid-unveiling, not from nerves, but from the sheer weight of her new robe, which included layered silk, 12 gold medallions, and a bejeweled sunburst collar designed by someone with clearly no understanding of human necks. You glance down a hall lined with display cases. Each contains mannequins draped in replicas of these ceremonial debuts. Some are dramatic robes split diagonally in contrasting color blocks, symbolizing the empire's balance between heaven and earth. Others are subtler, narrow cuffs, new embroidery patterns, and neckline shapes that marked changes in theological mood or court alliances. One robe, marked Winter Presentation, 987 AD, is covered in tiny stitched owls. Not a religious reference, just a trend. Everyone wanted owls that year. Historians still argue whether these unveilings were primarily political rituals, aesthetic showcases, or simply imperial entertainment disguised as ceremony. But there's no denying they drew attention. Ambassadors wrote home about them. Poets described them. At least one weaver fainted from excitement after seeing his trim on a bishop's cape. He reportedly woke up smiling. And these weren't solo affairs. Entire groups processed in matching garments, each color-coded, ranked, and precisely choreographed. You pass a wall chart labeled Standard Pairings for Appearances and Processions, royal purple with gold emperor and empress, indigo with silver, heir apparent and ecclesiastical guard, saffron and black chancellors during Lent, emerald and crimson, official mourners but only after Epiphany. The system was absurd and genius because no one had to ask who anyone was. They just had to look. And so the Byzantines built something no sword could touch: a visual empire, reborn in silk every season, stitched into perception, shimmering through the centuries. You pass one final display, a massive ceremonial cloak, 20 feet wide when unfurled, embroidered with scenes of Christ, Constantine, and a stylized silk worm curling along the hem. It's breathtaking. It's terrifying. It's fashion as theology. And as you stand there, still for a moment, you understand these robes weren't just clothes. They were spectacle. They were liturgical theater. They were policy announcements disguised as embroidery. You turn away slowly, the silent applause still echoing in your mind. Because in Byzantium, to be seen was to be known. And to be known, you had to shine. You leave the ceremonial hall behind like stepping out of a dream stitched in gold thread, your mind still catching glimpses of pearl-lined hems and embroidered halos that moved like celestial choreography. The corridor narrows now, and the scent of incense fades, replaced by something more anxious. Because if Byzantium's silk ceremonies dazzled the world, what happened when the silk stopped arriving? Welcome to the other side of the story. Tonight, we unravel the quiet catastrophes known as silk shortages and how a few worms, some bad weather, or a miscalculated border skirmish could send half the empire into a minor meltdown. You find yourself in a small administrative wing, one of those forgotten rooms with slanted windows, cracked floor tiles, and shelves full of dusty scrolls stamped in red wax. On the wall is a framed parchment with bold, urgent handwriting. Third shortage in 9 months. Reduce ceremonial trim. Delay export to Venice. Reassign dye reserves to ecclesiastical robes only. Mainstream fact: silk shortages in Byzantium weren't just inconvenient. They were political emergencies. When the raw materials faltered, whether due to silkworm blight, disrupted trade, or military blockade, the empire scrambled to maintain its image, authority, and literal wardrobe. You pass a display showing a series of robe fragments labeled Emergency Adjustments, 1031 AD. Each is slightly less ornate than the last one, missing border embroidery, another trimmed with cheaper thread, and one with a painted shimmer to fake gold weave. Yes, painted. Fringe tidbit. One particularly bad year forced the imperial court to dye leftover linen with saffron and apply powdered mica to mimic silk's sheen. It fooled no one. An ambassador from Bulgaria reportedly called the emperor's robe crispy looking. The scribe who recorded that had terrible handwriting, but a clear sense of drama. You pass a recreated worm bureau, a quiet chamber where sericulture administrators filed panicked reports like battlefield correspondence. One reads, worm yield down 37%. Mulberry Grove and Phocia diseased. Recommend we redirect prayers to St. John the Spinner. Yes, there was a patron saint for everything. Another scroll outlines the rationing plan for silk when supplies got tight. Imperial robes no change. Patriarchs' vestments preserved with priority incense. Court officials secondary bolts only. Gift silks to foreign dignitaries limited to single swatches. Folded creatively. Robes for minor festivals temporarily replaced with carefully ironed wool. You stop in front of a simple tunic on a mannequin. It looks dignified until you lean closer. The gold trim, tarnished bronze thread. The fabric, a coarsely woven silk-linen blend. The label reads formal wear during the silk panic of 1043. Historians still argue whether these shortages had lasting economic impacts or merely exposed the fragility of a system built on shine. But for a culture that ran on symbolism, the optics were everything. Imagine a public procession where the emperor's robe doesn't shimmer. A coronation where the trim has been recycled from last year. A diplomatic banquet where guests receive empty silk boxes, symbolically scented. You pass a cabinet marked false weave incidents. Inside are confiscated bolts from desperate or deceptive weavers. One uses stretched wool disguised with glue. Another layers translucent linen over a silver foil base. A scroll beside it lists penalties for weave fraud. One man was sentenced to weave only practical wool socks for 5 years. A fate worse than exile? Surely. And yet despite it all, the empire survived. Because Byzantium, more than anything, was about adaptation. It didn't collapse when silk grew scarce. It pivoted. It invented austerity protocols, redefined luxury and muted tones, leaned harder on ritual and scent and sleeve angles. When silk ran out, they made symbolism do the heavy lifting. You reach the end of the hallway where a candle flickers beside a final robe. Simple. Dark. Lined only at the cuffs. A note beneath it reads, "Last worn during the Great Shortage." It did not shine, but the people still bowed. You stand there a moment longer, the silence heavier now. Because in Byzantium, shimmer was power. But even when the shine dulled, the thread still held. You leave behind the faint shadows of economic panic, the scent of emergency saffron, and the quiet dignity of robes that didn't quite shimmer, and find yourself ascending a shallow marble staircase. The walls here are smooth and bare. No paintings, no glass cases, just echoing footsteps and the soft sound of rustling fabric somewhere ahead. You arrive at a small, domed room that feels more like a chapel than a dressing hall. The light filters in from a hidden oculus above, falling in a soft column over a single, carefully preserved robe, and beneath it, a plaque. It reads "Last of the Imperial Wardrobe," adjusted, restitched, worn until the end. Because this, dear listener, is where it all winds down, not just the robes, but the empire itself. This is the story of the last thread of imperial identity. Mainstream fact. As the Byzantine Empire crumbled in its final decades, ceremonial splendor didn't vanish all at once. Instead, the remaining court did something remarkable. They continued to maintain, adjust, and reuse the imperial garments of earlier centuries right up until Constantinople's fall in 1453. You walk slowly around the display. The robe is patched, delicately reworked, its original embroidery fading under careful layers of newer silk. A cuff bears the original thread from the 10th century. The lining was replaced in the 13th. The hem was shortened slightly in the 14th, probably to hide damage or to fit a shorter emperor. This robe is a timeline of repairs. Fringe tidbit. There's evidence that by the 1440s, the imperial tailors were disassembling older robes and reassembling them into composite garments, salvaging gold thread, trimming faded panels, even turning once outward-facing embroidery inside, so the shine could be conserved for special occasions. You pass a scroll mounted on the wall, a dry inventory list, but one with unusual emotion in the margins. 2 robes reserved. No new silks. Dye reserves low. Pattern reuse advised. Repair of collar approved. And beneath, scribbled in a different hand, still we must look like emperors. You sit for a moment on the stone bench nearby. You imagine the last emperor, Constantine V, rising before dawn to prepare for a ritual procession. The robe he wears has been worn by 8 others before him. Each thread holds a memory. Each trim has outlived 2 dynasties. The embroidery on the back might have been stitched by Theodora herself, centuries before. And still it fits. Imperfectly. But it fits. Historians still argue whether this conscious repurposing was pragmatic necessity or a symbolic refusal to yield. Was it about saving fabric, or saving the image of the empire itself? Perhaps it was both, because when walls were falling, allies were scarce, and the treasury was empty. The robe still shimmered just enough to remind everyone this was not a kingdom that had forgotten who it was. You glance up into the soft beam of light, catching a faint glint from the robe's edge. The gold thread there is fraying, yes, but it glows in a way that feels almost defiant. Even now, fringe detail. One chronicler writes that on the final day of Constantinople, as the Ottomans breached the city, the last emperor donned a simple imperial robe over his armor, not for defense, but for identity. He would fall as a ruler, not a soldier. No one ever found the robe, but the echoes of its stitching live on. You rise slowly. This time, you don't touch anything. You simply look at what remains, at what endures, at the cloth that carried 1,000 years of memory through triumph, scandal, fashion week, fiscal panic, and the gentle bite of a bureaucrat's incisors. Because it was never just silk. It was the empire itself, woven, mended, resilient, and in the end, still shimmering just enough. You stay for a moment longer in the silence, letting the light on that last robe flicker softly in your peripheral vision. Then you step away, not because you're done, but because the story has threaded its final stitch. You pass again beneath the arch, your sandals quiet now, your mind full of golden hems, whispered rituals, and the flutter of silkworm wings hiding in bamboo canes. You don't go back to the grand halls or the perfumed corridors. No, you find yourself in a smaller, plainer room, one that smells faintly of beeswax, ink, and something else memory. Maybe? This was once an office. A real one. Not a throne room. Not a robe chamber. Not a showroom of embroidered politics. Just 4 walls, a writing desk, and a locked cabinet. And inside that cabinet, a rolled bolt of perfectly ordinary silk. Light gray, unadorned, not imperial, not sacred, not even expensive. Just silk. Mainstream fact. In the end, most of the empire's garments were lost, burned, stolen, buried with forgotten bones. But some silk remained, quiet, anonymous, folded into the private homes of scribes and seamstresses, tucked away not as treasure but as memory. You run your hand gently across the cloth. It doesn't shimmer. It doesn't sing, but it feels familiar. Fringe tidbit. There's a story half true, half lost of an old tailor who, after Constantinople fell, continued sewing robes in secret. Using scraps he'd hidden for years, he sold them to no one, just made them, and buried them. 1 stitch per day. Because the empire may have fallen, but the thread hadn't snapped yet. Historians still argue whether the reverence for Byzantine silk survived in later traditions, or if it faded completely into folklore. But in every monastery that lit candles for old saints, in every merchant house that kept a robe under glass, in every child told that once, robes were bitten for truth. You feel the afterglow. You step outside, and the sky is low and golden. The wind picks up, rustling the trees. Mulberry leaves whisper. Somewhere nearby, a loom creaks as someone tests a new pattern. Unaware they're echoing a 1,000-year ritual. You smile, because this is what Byzantium left behind. Not an army, not a fortune, not even a city, but a sense of weight in the weave, a shimmer, a silence, a robe folded one last time. You close your eyes, and the empire vanishes not in flames but in fabric, worn, washed, whispered, but never forgotten. Now, as your eyes grow heavier and your breath evens out, let the sound of threads pulling gently through silk carry you into sleep. There's no need to hold on to the robes, the rules, or the rituals. You've seen them. You've traced the golden hem and followed the pattern to its last stitch. You've walked the corridors of an empire built on cloth, felt its warmth, its weight, its quiet insistence that identity can be woven, not shouted. You've sat among clerks, stood with spinners, watched emperors shimmer and vanish, and through it all, you've heard the soft echo of the loom steady, patient, eternal. Now imagine yourself beneath a mulberry tree, the leaves gently moving in the breeze. Above, the stars are veiled in cloud-soft silk. Around you, robes hang like curtains in a warm night wind, silent, breathless, whole. There's nothing to fix here. No tribunal, no inventory, no thread left to count. Only stillness. Breathe in. Let the scent of old myrrh and crushed violet drift through you. Breathe out. Let the weight of the empire slide gently from your shoulders. There is no need to rise, no need to mend, no more seams to align. Just let the story settle like a robe across your chest, familiar. Finished. You're not falling asleep. You're being wrapped in silk.